safety action.
I was wondering what I was going to do for a special this morning.
Hey, Dad.
So we got a great introduction to the special. Bless the Lord, oh my soul, oh my soul, worship His holy name. Sing like never before, oh my soul, I worship Your holy name. The sun comes up, it's a new day dawning. It's time to sing Your song again. Whatever may pass and whatever lies before me, let me be singing when the evening comes. Bless the Lord, oh my soul, oh my soul, worship His holy name. Sing like never before, oh my soul, I'll worship Your holy name. You're rich in love and You're slow to anger. Your name is great and Your heart is kind. For all Your goodness I will keep on singing. 10,000 reasons for my heart to find. Bless the Lord, oh my soul, oh my soul, worship His holy name. Sing like never before, oh my soul, I worship Your holy name. Bless You. And on that day when my strength is failing, the end draws near and my time has come, still my soul sing Your praise unending. 10,000 years and then forevermore.
holy name. Lord, I worship your holy name. Sing like never before. Oh, my soul, I worship your holy name. Jesus, I worship your holy name. Oh, Lord, I worship your holy name.
All right. Turn back with me to Acts chapter 20. Acts chapter 20. When we left Paul last week, he was in Ephesus. He had spent a couple of years in Ephesus building up the church. And then at the end of last week, or the last 2 weeks, we looked at him in Ephesus, and we saw the effects of the gospel on mankind. And we saw several effects that the gospel brings. There are those who truly embrace the gospel, those who surrender to the gospel, surrender their rights, their life to the gospel, and we see transformation. We see change. They are not what they used to be. Their priorities change. Their heart changes. Their vision changes. And we see a change in mankind. They no longer depend on what they used to put their faith in economically or socially or religiously. And they turn, and their whole focus and their whole trust in every area of their life is God, through Jesus Christ. And it has changed. It's a radical change in your life. I don't care what your background was. And then we saw the effects of the gospel on society. As individuals' lives change, then they start seeing things in a different light. And they begin to question societal structures that have long been held. And as they question those structures, they then change how they react to them, and structures then change. And so we see this change not in a forceful, powerful movement of mankind, not in a takeover, not in a requirement, but we see society change as individual lives change. And those individuals react to society and norms of society in a new way because they're looking for it through a new lens in their lives. Doesn't mean that they're forcing their neighbors to do that, but they are doing that. And as more and more people look through that lens, then society changes. So we see a change in society, but not overnight and not by force. By one person at a time changing their reaction to society. And so we see a change, and so the gospel changes society. The gospel also changes culture. And we see not all will accept, not all will surrender. Some will maintain their trust, their faith, in what they've always trusted in for their economic well-being, what they've always trusted in for their cultural recognition and position and power, what they've always trusted in to be right with the gods. And so as they then can maintain their old beliefs and their old faith, but see society and friends change, change is dangerous, change is stressful, and it causes them then to react in ever-increasing hostile and irrational ways. And this is the way that it's always been with faith. It's always been. As faith is gained, as people change, as society changes, that people will lash out. Not because these people are being jerks and trying to force them to change, though that may be their perspective, but because they see a difference. They see something different, and change is scary. I don't care where it is. And people don't like change. People are threatened by change, by doing something differently. And so we see them react in a hostile way and rejecting how God is leading his people. And we see that, not only do we see that last couple weeks in Ephesus, but as we read the New Testament, we see that throughout the world as God's gospel is going out. But not only do we see that today, don't we? And probably ever more drastically do we see that today in our own culture. For so long we've been insulated to this to some extent. It's always been there, but to some extent, because our cultural norms have revolved around at least religious values, whether we totally accept them or understand them or not. And so it wasn't as threatening of a change. But now we see, as culture is rejected, as culture is taking a different path, and they look at those of us of faith that see the world differently. It's no longer, okay, you be you and I be me. It's you're a threat to all of us. It kind of sounds like the first century again, doesn't it? And you need to conform. You need to get in line. You need to start being like us. Because you're different, and that's a threat. And that led, at the end of last week, to a riot, or almost a riot, to a conflict and hostility, and it took the town clerk to come in and quell that hostility and keep it from becoming a riot. And we looked at that last week. Now Paul sees this as a confirmation that it is indeed time to move on, to complete his journey. Remember, he started with a desire to go back to all the churches and strengthen them, to encourage them, to see how they were doing, to see what they need. And so he spent a lot of time in Ephesus, and so now he sees this as the time to continue on with that journey. So let's continue on in Scripture, beginning in Acts chapter 20. After the uproar had ceased, Paul sent for the disciples, and when he had exhorted them and taken them his leave of them, he left to go to Macedonia. When he had gone through those districts and had given them much exhortation, he came to Greece. And there he spent 3 months. And when a plot was formed against him by the Jews, as he was about to set sail for Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. And he was accompanied by Salvator of Berea, the son of Pyrrhus, and by Aristarchus and Secundus of the Thessalonians, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy, and Tychus, and Trophimus of Asia. You try to say those things many times fast. But these had gone on ahead and were waiting for us at Troas. We sailed from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread and came to them at Troas within 5 days. And there we stayed 7 days. So after this crisis is averted, Paul determines it's time to depart. It's time to continue on. This is God's sign. If you'll remember, before all these riots started, before all this conflict started, we're told that Paul purposed in the heart that it was time to move on. And he even sent some disciples ahead. And we see that it wasn't as clear as the Macedonia call, but God seems to indicate that it's about time to move. It's about time to go on. And Paul is trying to make sure that he's hearing from God and not reading his own plans into it. And so he lays it out before God to see, is this your will? And God then through this conflict, Paul sees that this is God's confirmation that it's time to depart. And before he leaves, he calls together the believers in Ephesus, and he places them in God's care to continue being witnesses and image bearers. Remember, this is a hard city. They've just had almost a riot. They've just drug a couple of the disciples and brought them up, and were ready to do harm to them. And so Paul has this heart. We see Paul as the evangelist, and he is, but Paul is much more than an evangelist. Paul has the heart of a pastor. Paul has an understanding that his goal is not to make converts. His goal is to make disciples. His goal is not to have somebody react emotionally. But his goal is to have somebody understand, make a conscious decision on who they will trust, understanding all the consequences of that, and then help them as they make that decision to put their faith and their trust in Jesus Christ, to help them then live through that decision. To be a disciple. One that then will replicate themselves as they share the gospel. And we're told after he encourages the believers, he leaves Ephesus and goes through Macedonia and Greece and the Aegean coast. And if you look at it, he makes basically the same trip that he started. He went to Troas. Now in Troas, we're told in 2 Corinthians, this isn't in Acts, but I want to tie 2 Corinthians together here. We're told in 2 Corinthians that Paul had sent Titus to deal with an issue in the church in Corinth. Way out here in Achaia. And he expected Titus to catch back up with him in Troas before he continued on in his journey. And we're told in 2 Corinthians that Titus was delayed in coming. And instead of waiting any longer, Paul continues on, and he goes through all the towns where he has established the church, where there are established believers. Also, by the way, all the towns where he has seen success of the gospel, but he's also seen persecution and been run out of town. And when he's run out of town, he never forgets. He has a heart for the people. He says, oh, these people, it was better for them that I leave, because I'm kind of the match that sparks the flame. But how are they doing? I'm worried for them. I pray for them. I hope they're holding fast to their faith. I hope they're enduring any persecution. I hope they're not succumbing to the pressures of society. And he has this pastor's heart that makes him want to go back over and over and over again to encourage and check up on. Just kind of as a side note, if we looked in Romans and 2 Corinthians, as he's doing this journey, we're told he's also collecting an offering for the church in Jerusalem. And and so when we see this list of names, you'll notice they all come from the major regions. And so these are people who accompany Paul, but they're probably also the ones that are being responsible for the offering from their region. And as they go back to Jerusalem with Paul, they're the ones that can present it to the church in Jerusalem. They're the one that's going to give a report of what God's doing in their region. Kind of a lot of times how our missionaries do. They come back and give reports of what God's doing. And it's a sense of honor that they have received a blessing, a benefit of people such as Paul and Apollos and the others that we see a spiritual blessing from the church in Jerusalem, and they now want to return that blessing to the church. And they do that in a form of an offering and testimony. And so that's a little aside to tie in some of the other writings of Paul to let us know what's going on as he's going around. He's encouraging them, but he's also allowing them to be a part of the ministry to encourage the church in Jerusalem. And we're told that as he goes through, his purpose then is, as he reaches the end of Achaia, is then to sail for Syria. That's what he did last time. If we were to go back to the second map of the second missionary journey, you'd seen what? We'd seen sail back to Syria, right? Then go up to Jerusalem. And that's his purpose, but we're told something stops him from doing that. What is it? He finds out there's a plot on his life. There's a plot on his life. Well, that's nothing new for Paul. But in God's direction and his wisdom, he changes his plans. He's not so stuck in his plans that they become the plan becomes sacred, but the God who's given him and leading him becomes sacred. And so we see him change the plans. And his plan now is to send some of his disciples, some of those who are following him, by sea to Troas, while he himself returns the opposite direction. over the land route, back through the churches. And so he takes this path as he goes back and meets them then with the intent of meeting them in Troas. After 5 days of crossing from Macedonia to Asia, Paul finally arrives in Troas. If you'll remember, it took 3 days to get across to Macedonia. It takes 5 days to get back because of currents and winds and all that. So it takes him 5 days to cross, and he finally arrives at Troas, and he spends a week there celebrating the Feast of Unleavened Bread with his disciples. And so let's pick it up in verse 7. And so what we're going to see is Paul has worshipped. He's celebrated the Feast of Unleavened Bread. He's worshipped with the Jews in the synagogue on the Sabbath. Now the Sabbath, remember, is sundown Friday night to sundown Saturday. That is the Sabbath. And so he's worshipped with them on the Sabbath. And then Saturday into Sunday, sorry. And then on Monday, Resurrection Day, we see him worship with the Christians. And this is one of the first times we see this change. There's been a shift of the day that Christians worship, and it's a shift away from their Jewish roots. And so we see this shift from not worshiping on the Sabbath, because the Sabbath is when the Jews worship, but to worshiping on the Resurrection Day, on Monday, or on Sunday, on Sunday, Resurrection Day. And this is so ingrained in us that we get this messed up. It is sundown Friday to sundown Saturday is the Sabbath, but then on Sunday is Resurrection Day. All of a sudden, we are now worshiping God's resurrection, His revelation. And so we see this shift here in these scriptures. So look at verse 7. On the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul began talking to them, intending to leave the next day, and he prolonged his message until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where we were gathered together. Notice the we, so Luke is there with him at this point. And there was a young man named Eutychus sitting on the windowsill, sinking into a deep sleep. And as Paul kept on talking, he was overcome by sleep and fell down from the third floor and was picked up dead. But Paul went down and fell upon him, and after embracing him, he said, "Do not be troubled, for his life is in him." When he had gone back up and had broken the bread and eaten, he talked to them a long while until daybreak, and then left. They took away the boy alive and were greatly comforted. So we see Paul travels, he comes to Troas, he celebrates the Feast of Unleavened Bread with the Jews. Then on the first day of the week, he celebrates with the Christians. And we get a sense of what does first century worship look like in these verses. First of all, we see it was shifted to the first day of the week. The resurrection was so big, was so cataclysmic, that worship was shifted for it. And Christians started gathering together on that first day of the week to worship the fact that not only did God die for our sins, but that God proved that that sacrifice was accepted through the resurrection of Jesus. And so we see that they gathered together. We see that their gathering was in houses. When we think of first century worship, you can't think of our experience of coming to a building and having some formal ceremony. You do 3 songs, you do 2 songs, you do an offertory song, then you do a special, then you do a sermon, then you do they didn't have that kind of formal structure. It was more doing life together. And so we see them as they come together. What are we told they do? They break bread, they fellowship, they talk, they discuss the Word. They discuss life and how the Word is applied to everyday life. It looks a lot less like what we do here on Sundays, a lot more like what we're doing on Wednesday nights. It's in a home, it's worship, but it's life together. It's small, intimate groups. It's not this formal setting. And so, now not saying that what has developed to is wrong, just saying that's not what the first century was. When we look at the early church, it's more intimate than that. It's more about doing life together than that. And so, as he's speaking to them, he wants to encourage them. We're going to find out later, in his heart of hearts, he doesn't think he's going to see them again. We're going to find that out next week. And because of that, there's a lot he wants to share with them. Think about that. He has come back to encourage and see where they were and help them as they've lived in these hostile places, being faithful to the gospel. If he doesn't think he's coming back, he's kind of passing the torch along. Hey, I'm not going to be here. I want to make sure you're prepared for this. You're going to start the time where I'm not going to be able to come back and encourage you all the time. You need to be prepared. And we're told he has so much to talk to them, he talks until midnight. Now, you think my sermons are long if I go a quarter after, a quarter till. If I had been speaking and gone to midnight, even in my house, what do? At some point in time, we're having a great time worshiping. And what I tell you, I say, hey, y'all let me stay as long as you want to worship, but at some point in time, I'm going to bed. Right? And I'm joking. I'm joking when I say that. But Paul's not joking. Paul's hanging out. Paul is teaching. Paul is fellowshipping. And he has so much to share with them and pour into them. We're told that he does that till midnight. And he's not really stopped at midnight. But something happens at midnight. At midnight, there's this young man, where he's called a young man. The term young man is probably somewhere between 8 and 14 years old. So when you think of young man in this context, you're thinking of what we would deem probably a teenager or a preteen. Okay? So a young man whose name, and here's, the Bible's full of this, and his name, Eutychus, means lucky one. Think about that. Lucky one's about to fall out the window. So his name means lucky one. And he's there and he's listening. And you just got to put yourself in the environment. You've worked all day. Monday's the first day of the week. It's a work day. You've worked hard. You're listening to Paul speak. He's speaking long. You've got lamps. It's dark. You don't have incandescent lighting. It's dark. And lamps are there. And that kind of flicker of the lamps puts you into hypnosis, doesn't it? If you've ever been in that environment. The heat and the sense of the lamps kind of lull you to sleep. And so with all of this going on, he falls asleep. And he plunges, we're told, 3 stories to his death. All while Paul's still talking. Paul is still talking and he's falling. And it isn't until he falls and dies that they realize something tragic has happened. This young man has fallen and he's dead. And they rush down to give him aid. They find out he's dead. And they're ready to prepare the body for burial. But Paul, again, he cares more for the person than necessarily for being the center of attention and speaking. What does he do? He stops his talking. He goes to this young man and he embraces him. Now think about that for a minute. He embraces him. What has he said his goal is? Why is he on a timeline? Or maybe we haven't gotten to that yet, but his goal is to get back to Jerusalem to celebrate Pentecost. In a Jewish context, to touch a dead body makes you unclean. And to be unclean means you have to go through the rituals before you can enter the temple and participate in the celebration. Think about that for a minute. Paul is so in tune with the gospel, so carried, that he was willing to give up his purpose to embrace this young man. He has faith that God has a plan, and though it seems mutually exclusive, that God will take care of this. And sure enough, he does. He embraces him and he announced that the young man is not dead, but is alive. The young man is not dead, he's alive. God has done a miracle. He has done something spectacular. And after this miracle, we're told Paul goes back to where he was teaching. And he continues teaching and fellowshipping and worshiping all the way until daybreak, and it's time to go. Doesn't faze Paul in the least. He trusts God. And we see his love not only for the church, but for the people who are the church. Let's continue on. Paul's co-workers, after daybreak, Paul's co-workers head to Assos by boat, while Paul goes by land to link up with them there. Now, this is going to be a rough trek for Paul because it's quite rugged and mountainous terrain. Instead of taking the boat, he's going to take the rough mountainous terrain. And so let's look at that in verse 13. But we, going ahead to the ship, set sail for Assos, intending from there to take Paul on board, for so he had arranged it, intending himself to go by land. And when he met us at Assos, we took him on board and came to Mytilene. Sailing from there, we arrived the following day opposite Dyess. And the next day we crossed over to Samos, and the day following we came to Miletus. For Paul had decided to sail past Ephesus so that he would not have to spend time in Asia, for he was hurried to be in Jerusalem, if possible, on the day of Pentecost. So Paul meets his traveling companions, and he sends them on now again by boat to Assos. As he travels the land route, the mountainous land route around, and from there, we're told he picks up in the boat and he continues to travel. And then he passes by Ephesus, we're told. Why? He has 610 miles to go to get back to Jerusalem. And he only has 5 weeks to get there in time. So he's on a tight time schedule. He says, I love the people in Ephesus, but I've spent 2 years there. I'm on a tight time schedule. I'm going to pass by there. And we're told that he then stops there, but he doesn't forget Ephesus. And that's what we're going to look at next week. It's such a big passage and such an important passage that I wanted to save for next week. He calls the elders, the pastors from Ephesus, so that he can give them final words. So that's where we're going to leave him today. And next week we'll pick up in Miletus with the pastors coming. And we're going to pick up his speech there. So what do we get out of this? It seems rather boring. It's just a travel log. It's kind of like reading somebody's journal of I went here, I went there, I went somewhere, maybe a quick story somewhere about some guy falling out of a window. And what do we get out of this? Well, one of the things that we can glean from this is that our purpose is to make disciples. Evangelism is sharing the good news of God's pardon over rebellion. And its goal is discipleship. What is it not? Evangelism is not isolationist form where we bring people to church. Evangelism is taking the good news of the gospel to people who have not made that decision, and sharing and encouraging and answering and walking, and then, yes, uniting them with the body when they've made that decision. Now, you may be in that discussion that before they make that decision, they want to come hear more and come, and that's great. We should encourage that. But the goal is to make disciples. People who make a decision for Christ. Evangelism isn't an emotional appeal and a reaction to an emotional appeal. And, there was a time in church life where the invitation wouldn't be hey, come and do whatever God's laid on your heart. There would just be this emotional techniques to manipulate people forward. And you've probably experienced them. I have, right? You go through a little bit of time of response, and then what does the pastor do? Everybody bow your head and close your eyes. Does anybody want this? Raise your, I see you. I see you. Right? And it's this emotional appeal. And then we wonder why, if they do respond to that, they never remain faithful. We never see them again. That's not a real salvation experience. It's not a real decision. Discipleship, evangelism, is sharing all aspects of the gospel. The love of Christ, the grace of God, the adoption into God's family, becoming a child of the King with what? Both its privileges, but also its responsibilities. We like to leave that part out because they may not respond if they know there's responsibilities to it. But it's giving them, remember what we saw 2 weeks ago, it's bringing them to a point of decision. Over and over and over again. So that they know the decision that they're making. And they can make an informed decision of, yes, I trust Christ, and I surrender all rights to my life, no matter what comes along. With all the rights and the responsibilities. Or, no, I don't, and I want nothing to do with this person I think is out there, and is bigoted, and is unloving. Or, I don't, but I'm interested. Let's keep talking. Evangelism is about bringing people to making a decision, an informed decision, where they truly surrender their lives, not where they react on emotions. I'm having a hard time in my life. So if I join the church, then God may bless me. God's not a great wishing well. He's not a genie. It's surrendering your life no matter what God does. No matter what happens. That's salvation. And salvation is not a quick encounter. We see Paul go back over and over and over again. It takes time. Paul spends different amounts of time in each city, but he spends time. In Ephesus, he knew that this would be a tough crowd. He knew it was a home of Artemis, of the worship of Artemis. And he knew, and he did what? He spent 2 years of his life there, investing in the people. In other places, he didn't spend as much time. Sometimes God determined how much time they spent. I don't know how long he planned on staying in Thessalonica. God did, though. And he was run out. But he wouldn't run out against God's will. God allowed it. It was time. And he was okay with that. And he went on. And so we see as Paul is faithful, he's going back to these hard areas. He's trusting God for his itinerary. His heart is, I care about people. I want them to be disciples of Christ. I want them to remain faithful. I want them to persevere in the midst of persecution. And I care about them. But that's not just Paul. We're all called to be that. We're all called to be those missionaries. We're all called to be those who share. We're all called to be those who go out to the lost. Whether that's in a class. There was a time when I was in Kansas City, they were looking, one of the major, I think it was University of Phoenix or somewhere, they were looking for an adjunct professor of religion for their online classes, and I applied, went through 3 or 4 levels of interview. And my whole thought process, believe me, I had plenty to do. I didn't need anything else. But it just was impressive. I was teaching at Midwestern at the time, but those are all people coming to Bible college. I want to go to them, to the lost. I want people, I want to be honest and be able to share with those who don't believe. We were talking about being a bivocational pastor, where all I've ever been is a full-time pastor. I wanted to be a bivocational pastor. I wasn't looking for a full-time pastor when I came here. Why? There's some great benefits to being a full-time pastor. There's a lot more study time. But you know what you don't have as a full-time pastor that I learned? You have much less time with the lost. You spend all your time as a full-time pastor dealing with just grown Christians. That's the majority of your job. And very little time really getting to minister to the lost. or witness to the lost. As a bivocational pastor, I spend part of my time here, but the majority of my time is with the lost, working alongside them, being in the same environment they're in, facing the same stresses they face, the same challenges of bosses and of clients, and but yet being different because my lens is different. Now, it doesn't mean all of my counselors are lost. I have some great Christians there, and we have great times of fellowship together. And that's also beneficial. There has been times we've been able to hold each other accountable. And been able to say, hey, yes, this is frustrating, but we can't respond that way. Yeah, I know everybody else is, but we can't. That's not demonstrating our faith. And we've been able to hold each other accountable for that. But by and large, it's able to be that witness. And that's what I missed